So I just want to introduce the book first. I'm in a small clergy group. We don't actually know each other that well, except one of the clergy members has led like a let's read a book and talk about it once a month. And we've read a couple of different books that were kind of interesting. One was like post-COVID, like what's the end game here? And he's a real academic, kind of like used to be a professor. So we read like management books, and we've read a couple other books that have been real interesting. But this by far has been like the most gripping book for me. And this came from Jason Ingalls, who is the rector at Holy Spirit in Waco. And so I've been thinking about it so hard, and obviously preaching about it the last couple of weeks, mainly because it has put its finger on a lot of practices that I don't even have any mental room for. So just to be fair, like I grew up evaluating everything, not observing, evaluating. And I think that's the hook for me about this book is, like the opportunity. And I think there was the quote that we already read that like in the Hindu tradition, there's this like the most enlightened person is somebody who can describe instead of evaluate. So I don't know if you found that in any way like hooking. But what I wanted to do, having introduced a little bit of how I connected with the book and how I'm trying to figure out how to do it, because honestly, like I'm so cast in the evaluative system that I'm often at a loss for words. Like I don't even know what to say because I'm so used to saying like, oh, that was really good, or like I feel disrespected, which is like not a feeling. Anyway, so that's my introduction, and we read just 2 chapters of this, right? Which maybe we're going slow, maybe we're going too fast, I don't know, but hopefully like 2 chapters is going to be a good rhythm to go. That's kind of where I want to stay so we can deal with the practice. But what I wanted to do is see if there were any parts of these chapters that really piqued your interest, or you're bristling at like, I don't know about that, or hey, I get this idea, but I'm not really sure what it would look like to do that. Like I'm not really sure what I do next, or even just, wow, like that wording was really compelling for me. So this is just my very omnibus opening to like, how does this book touch you?
My goddamn webmail.
Kathy, I see you're set.
Well, I actually read through chapter 3 because I couldn't remember where we were supposed to stop. And I loved the examples that he gave and showing how effective this technique is. But boy, howdy, is this going to be hard to do. And he gave the one example where he went to the school, and I don't remember if this is in chapter 2 or 3, but like trying to get the teachers. And then even after he worked with them to talk to the principal, they still couldn't do it. They knew what they wanted to say, but they didn't understand. So I think maybe going slow is good, because I think it's going to take all of us a lot of work to figure this out. But I think we'd all be better off if we did.
Thank you. Darlene, I think I saw you ready to hop in.
Yes, I was connecting to your comparison with some Hindu thinking. There's also some connection with Buddhist thinking in that, in terms of comparison and evaluation. Nothing in itself is, most things are not good or bad, they just are. And it's how we choose to think about those things that makes them so for us. And when we choose to change our thinking away from the evaluation to just being with that person or being with that feeling, that's where we can gain some control.
Thank you. Julia.
Along that line, Darlene, like in chapter 2, the first part, talking about the different types of communications that passion, and just the idea of these moralist judgments, and how one of the little blurbs, but enough of others are actually extensions of our own needs and values, which was so interesting. And so like after I read that, it was like I couldn't do anything but, you know, like judge everyone I heard speaking and like how they were saying. I was like, well, that's what you're doing, you know, like it's interesting. It just seems like so pervasive that that's just like how I communicate, how like so many people communicate is I thought that was really interesting. And then something else along those lines too is part of me felt like I was reading some of the examples, like if I was on the receiving side, I would almost feel like it was condescending towards me or like, but I think that's just like how I'm like, it's almost like a thing, if that makes sense. I don't know exactly where that comes from. I'm not sure if anyone else felt that way, but I thought that was kind of interesting.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Are you referring to like, I can't remember if it's in chapter 1 or 2 where he does like an example of a dialogue that he was like a killer, and there was 27 years of the US coming to their country. Are you referring to like the dialogue there?
Yeah, that was the one that I felt like, I mean, I saw what he was trying to do, but I felt like if I had been on the receiving side, it sounded like it took it like the end, it said after an hour, 20 minutes or however long. Like, I think it would probably take me that long to like come around and not be so angry.
Yeah, we had a similar discussion about that.
Yeah, and I've got a bit of a background in conflict resolution management from the past, and these I statement things are really effective, but they can get, if you follow the pattern, which is good at the beginning when you're learning, it can get repetitive. There's a story about a salesperson who was using this with a purchasing agent, and his boss was in the room. He was, repeating back what he'd heard and things like that. And at some point, the guy gets frustrated that he's talking to and says, "Is there an echo in here?" Because he keeps hearing back what he's heard. So you got to be careful using this stuff, but it does work. I think I was raising my hand a little while later, or thinking about it. I need to be more. Anyway, I think the hardest part for me of this practice is figuring out what my feeling is, right? I can do the observation, I know the value, but how am I actually feeling is tough. And I'm looking forward to in this book for a better way to access that.
Yeah, thanks. And Mike, I want to follow up on that. I have a priest who's a colleague who's been into this work for a while, and she sent me a couple of worksheets that are like feeling sheets. What I really appreciated about the work is like, I so often want to tell my kids, I feel really disrespected, which is not a feeling.
Thank you.
And that's where I'm like, oh my gosh, like my whole language system is broken,
Yeah.
And I don't want to always just say like, I feel sad. So like reinventing the vocabulary is really important. And I do want to say, I'm looking forward to Brene Brown's new book that's coming out in November is called The Alphabet of the Heart. And really all it is a research-based description of like 60 feelings. So I'm really looking forward to like upping my repertoire. I do have, I linked this in the e-news a couple of weeks back, but I do have these handouts from my colleague friend down in Texas City that names like emotions versus evaluations. And something she's even done is made like a vocabulary deck so that she can reinforce these feeling words, quite honestly, and use like appropriate words like that we actually feel instead of, I feel like you're lazy, which is not a feeling at all,
Yeah, I feel like there's a problem and it's you.
No.
That's not an I statement.
No.
I think the thing about the I statements too, right? I've been in like therapy office where I feel like they're just doing the technique. And he talks about this at the very beginning, especially if you listen to the audiobook, like you can master the mechanics, but if you don't put the empathy behind them, it is just a technique, right? And so like, I think there's this really interesting thing where if somebody says like, hey, are you just mirroring? Like the reply is like, your needs are really important to me. And I want to make sure I'm hearing what you're trying to communicate instead of just what I think. And that's why I'm marrying this back to you. I want to confirm that I'm hearing what you're trying to tell me. I think not only is that disarming, I think if you say it like authentically, like it's effective, because it really speaks to like, I'm not just doing a technique to do a technique. Like I'm using a technique to support the connection that I don't even always want in the moment, but in the long term, I do.
We've had a couple of moments just reading just the first 2 chapters of I walk into the room and go, okay, I don't have a non-violent way to say what I'm about to say, and I need some help. So at least we're aware. But.
And what an interesting way to practice it though, right? Is to say like, I don't know. And are you willing to work through this? Like, would you be patient so we can draw this out, what I'm trying to communicate? I actually think that sometimes we are afraid to do that with children because we think we're supposed to be directive. And what's really sad, right, is it denies them the opportunity to learn with us and even be directive. You know, like sometimes kids are like, Mom, that's not an issue. Like, just say this, you know, like they're able to just do that.
And even ask me, how could I say this better?
Yeah.
So that you could hear me or that you wouldn't feel offended. Help me find the words.
Mm-hmm. I want to reflect on something that happened in chapter 2, because it actually played out in my week a couple of times in various ways. And that is this discussion about moral principles, deciding whether or not people deserve to be punished. I actually am like really trying to take that really, really deep, because given the week we've had, I did have somebody ask me, what's the moral principle we teach young people about their sexuality? And really the question was, what about people who get abortions? And that one seemed really important to me, because the answer was, what's the moral principle? And immediately I was like, oh, in chapter 2, I'm not supposed to do moral principles, because that's how we like justify punishing people. And so what I was able to do, and I don't know if it was super effective, is to sort of like talk with this person about, hey, you know, moral principles are really, really tough, particularly when they come fully at the expense of one of 2 parties in a relationship, right? It's really tough. And so I don't really know that I have a moral rule. Instead, I think there's like some key variables, right? Some key variables are things like earned trust. And trust is earned. Like, you don't just feel like trusting somebody with something intimate, like that needs to be earned. Mutuality, a container for vulnerability. And what's interesting, right? We ended up talking about like, well, what about marriage and stuff? And like, marriage does not necessarily give an appropriate container for vulnerability. It can, but it doesn't necessarily, right? And so like, if we enter into a marriage so we can get a container for vulnerability that hasn't been earned, it ain't gonna work. I mean, I want to be really clear about that. That's why we do premarital counseling, right? We do premarital counseling to say like, warts and all, are you really all in? And if you haven't seen the warts, like, let's take another look so that you know, right? This person is not just some, we call it idealistic distortion, right? Like, if you go into marriage and you say, everything my spouse does is wonderful and delightful, the rude awakening is coming soon. Right. I mean, I don't know how soon, but within 2 years, that's really clear evidence. On the other hand, if you say, hey, my spouse does this thing and I don't love my spouse in spite of this, I love my spouse because of this thing. Okay, like now we're outside of the distortion, right? Like, eyes wide open, you're really clear, and you choose to like love this idiosyncrasy. It's not that you deny it, like, you know about it. And I think that's all related to this business, because again, of the laws this week, I don't want to be overly political, but I'm real concerned. I also had somebody talk to me this week because they felt very estranged from God, because they were doing this particular thing that was they thought was against the moral teaching of the church. And when they did this thing, they felt like they had offended God. And so it's like this really interesting thing to think about, this sort of really deep lie I've learned spiritually. And I'm just going to air it with you. The lie that I've learned spiritually is, I make God mad. You did that thing, and that makes God mad. And the book says, well, if God's mad, God chose that. And me taking responsibility for God's feelings is the definition of living in hell. That's what I've decided this week. God can be responsible for God's own feelings. Like, I don't need to be responsible for God's feelings. I need to be responsible for my own feelings, and I choose that. But I don't make my spouse mad. My spouse chooses anger over sadness. I don't make God mad. God chooses anger over whatever. And by the way, I don't think God chooses anger. And so, like, I've really trying to come to terms with this idea that these moral judgments are like this really kind of sick spirituality. I just want to be honest with you. I think it's a really sick spirituality because, you know, like when we enforce a punishment system, what kids usually think, we say something like, if I catch you doing this, this will be the punishment. And what most kids and adults think is, well, fine, I'll just make sure you don't catch me. But what we've done with God is we've said, God will always catch you. And you will make God angry. I just want you to like sit on that for a second, you know? Because I was like talking to a person, like I said, this week, and he said, you know, what's interesting, right? Is like this core verse that we've memorized. God so loved the world that God gave God's only son. Like, we didn't ever take that seriously. The way we've been taught to read that verse is, well, God's fundamentally disappointed with the world, but like, you know, God will give you a life preserver. God was so disappointed with humanity that God gave Jesus instead of like, hey, faults and all, like God chooses to love you. And that Jesus isn't an investment. Like, if you don't accept this investment, you're going to hell. He's a gift. And gifts are like irrevocable, and they're given out of a place of generosity and love, not as like a carrot to reward you if you do the right thing. And I'm going to sound really radical, but a lot of my spirituality, frankly, is just social control. That's what I was given. A spirituality of social control. The church doesn't want me to do these certain things because they're moral principles, and I'll be punished if I break them, instead of, let's talk about really larger life and larger ways of living. I think we can end up with some of the same conclusions, but the way we do it really matters.
If the things that we do make the God feel happy or sad, isn't that the definition of idolatry? Aren't we making God an idol then?
That we can, and frankly, we're in control of God.
Yeah.
And is that how, I mean, like, but that's most of my spirituality. Like, most of my spiritual upbringing was predicated on that. I didn't see it that way at the time. But the book is like breaking that open for me.
So I have a question then along that. So are we trying to live I'm not sure it's the right words. So are we trying not to hurt our neighbor and trying to love our neighbor because we do it because it's right in and of itself, or are we doing it because God taught us to do that, or Jesus, or, you know, so why do we love our neighbor? What's our motivation for loving our neighbor?
I think it's a great question. And actually, you know, like, I love this definition by a Jesuit. There's this Jesuit who says, a saint is somebody who's aware of the selfishness behind their every motive. And there's this really great thing about like loving my neighbor. If I can't love my neighbor and this is what James says, if you can't love your neighbor who you see, how can you love God who made your neighbor who you cannot see? And if I judge my neighbor, right? If I judge my neighbor and condemn my neighbor, I'm going to treat myself exactly that way. So we think like, what's in it for us, frankly, is joy. And C.S. Lewis has this whole argument. If joy is from God, follow joy no matter where it is. That's different from happiness, right? Mm-hmm. Happiness is like circumstance-based. But if joy is from God, then not only is joy never wrong, it's always right. And I sort of think that being able to love my neighbor who's different from me like to deeply love them, I think that's joyful. I think that's why we do it. Think how sad it is to go around condemning our neighbor, because what that reveals is how much we dislike ourselves.
Then if we are loving our neighbor because it brings joy to ourselves, and that's a good thing for the greater good as well, then how does God fit in the equation?
So it's a wonderful question, and I don't have like the answer, but I have an answer. And people on the screen have seen this lovely little diagram before. I'm a mathematician, and sort of. I'm not a very good one, it turns out, but I did get a math degree. And once upon a time, I taught geometry to 8th graders. And there's this really old Orthodox diagram that says this dot is like where we are. And notice it's distant from like union with God, and it's distant from union with the self God made us to be, and distant from other people. And the old explanation of this diagram is the distance from God, ourself, and others, it's equidistant. So like I learned this really dreadful spirituality that if I want to get closer to God, I need to like crucify my flesh and hate myself. But the diagram says the more you hate yourself, the more you hate God. And the diagram suggests that as you draw closer to your neighbor, you are also drawing closer to God and the self God made you to be. And like if you have a mystical experience with God, like mystical union, and it's spiritually empowering, the test is, do you love your neighbor more? And if you don't, you had a false experience. I find it so holistic, this Orthodox diagram that's about 1800 years old, right? And again, what I learned is that we can live these kind of like scaling triangles where we get really, really close to God by getting farther away from our neighbors who are probably sinners, and probably getting further away from ourselves. And we're probably like yucky, corrupt things. And the diagram says no. And it's predicated, I think, on a lot of wisdom, right? Because, like in my own experience, having been evaluative and competitive, if my neighbor came in with a gift I didn't have, I tended to be jealous or dismissive instead of being grateful for them, right? And so I think like when we see difference, those tend to be our reactions, jealousy or dismissiveness, instead of like, I'm glad you've got that gift, because the world needs that. And frankly, I'd like to benefit from it. And not just I want to suck it dry from you, I got gifts you may not have. So like we get to share that stuff. Peggy, yeah, you just have to hit unmute. There you go.
Morning. I'm really enjoying this book, but I'm also looking at it through a Kohlberg levels of moral development. So I always have to understand when I'm talking to a person at what level they're really coming from. So what do you think about that?
I think it's a great thought. And I think, Peggy mentioned this guy, Larry Kohlberg, who came out with an omnibus moral development theory in the late 70s. It was pretty bold. People quit coming out with like these meta theories pretty much in the late 60s. Because when you have a meta theory, really easy to poke holes in it. But Kohlberg came out with this moral development theory that goes in stages. Beginning with like, what's in it for me? It's all very self-driven. And at the end, you end up with like the highest, the golden rule is basically what he says, right? Like, or what does Kant call it? The categorical imperative, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Kohlberg says you can't get there until you're in your 30s and you've had a college degree. So until you have those things, like you don't make it. And what's really interesting is Kohlberg had a student called Carol Gilligan, and he worked with her. Actually, he was really happy to work with her. She said, hey, that diagram's might be true for men, but it's not true for women. Women are taught to absolutely deny themselves. So women's highest stage of moral development is when they return to themselves. actually Kohlberg was delighted, although Gilligan chose to like be adversarial with him the whole time. It's like a strange thing. But I think it's really, really helpful because Peggy, like a lot of people I know who are really, really educated, bright people, and I'm going to sound like I'm evaluating them, but I don't mean to. I think a lot of us, regardless of our education, are still stuck on moral development phase 1 when it comes to our spirituality. And I remember this really distinctly teaching at a Christian high school. I mentioned one time to my class of students, like, hey, what if there was no heaven and hell when you died? And one of my kids said, well, then what would be the point of faith? And that was the principal's son. And I thought, okay, so like your faith is a barter economy in which you get something by frankly hating yourself and most other people. And this should seem really incongruous because the top of the moral development theory is you do unto others as you would like to be done to you. Also acknowledging that other people have different tastes and preferences, right? So you can't just say, I love hamburgers, everybody eat hamburgers, even if you're vegan. You actually have to consider other people's cultural context and how do I honor them in the middle of difference? I think it absolutely fits in though. I mean, I think it absolutely fits in. And basically the way it fits in is that if you want to, and I don't like that it's hierarchized, Kohlberg's model, I don't, but I do think it offers this idea, right? Like, hey, when we're talking to other people non-violently, it really means we're going to that like top value of like, what need are you trying to meet? Here's what's alive in me, what's alive in you. And that really is how we honor doing unto other people as we have them do unto us, I think. And when you draw out of people, right, when people say something that just irks you and you say, sounds like you're really, when you take the time to empathize, like you're creating a container for them, that ultimately it'd be great if people would create that container for you. I think a lot of times caring for people like this, frankly, is just inefficient. And we're worried it won't work. But what we miss, right, is that like, it's the work itself that's transformative for us. It's not outcome-based, it's the work. And, at the end of the day, like it would be great. My family may not have to come out where I am, but if they would make a container for me to talk about where I am, that would be life-giving for me. So I get to do that too, Darlene.
And we don't have to worry about doing it perfectly. We talked earlier about the wording not being quite right, the wording making us feel defensive, or we chose to feel defensive because of the wording. And so that makes us feel inhibited about not doing it just right. Yeah. But if we say, I'm not sure I'm doing this right, but I'm trying to understand, help me understand, rather than having the declarative statements of, I think you're feeling, it's more, help me understand how you're feeling. There's that working through that process of building understanding, and in the process of that, building relationship.
And what you said,
if we're vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think that's the whole key, because like, many of us and myself, I will use the phrase, help me understand, as an accusation. You did this really stupid thing. Help me understand why you did that. That's right. So again, it's not just the mechanics. It has to be the underlying desire of like, I really don't understand. And I'm open to understanding that like this was your best thinking, not your worst. I don't see it, but I'd like to. In general, I use the phrase, help me understand. You're wrong, and I don't want to understand why you did that. I just want you to know you're wrong. And when you try to explain it, we'll both realize how wrong you were. And that's where like the tone and the under part really does matter. Julia, please.
So I think kind of along those lines too is this idea of, personal responsibility. or like the denial of responsibility. And like, man, that's totally something I do, you know, like it's so hard to kind of own up to the fact that like you are making that choice to, you know, respond in that way or you know, act in that way or feel that way. And kind of like what Darlene was saying, like you can choose to like change that thinking. And I think that like, I don't know, I really appreciated that whole little section on denial of responsibility, and where he quotes the French novelist, like, man, like just a constant increase in the number of obedient, docile men. I thought that was really interesting. But just how like, I don't know, that's just sounds like it's gonna take a lot of work. Like, oh, it's just so, you know, opposite from how I've sort of been ingrained in how I speak.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's great to remind us it's holy work with a W, but it's also holy work with an H. Yeah,
I really related to the, I'm sorry, Father Mike.
No,
I
please.
was just going to add to Julia's comment. I really related to the have to statements, because we go through a lot of things in life where we feel like we have to do this, you know, and Mike and I had I don't want to say it's a pretend conversation, but like we were trying to act like we were arguing about, I don't have to work, you know, I could sell my home and live off the money of my home, you know, like the different things to say. The have tos were hard to own up. But I don't know that I liked the example of the have to that the teacher gave. And maybe I relate to that because I am a teacher, but she didn't like having to give grades. And then she ended up saying, I want to give grades to keep my job. Kind of, I don't know. I wanted a better replacement for the have to on that one, but that one was hard.
I think the fiction like is appropriate, right? Because like, I mean, that's the end game, is the teacher does not have to do it. It feels like we have to. It feels like we're out of control. And I think what he's trying to say is, no, actually, like a lot of the things that feel out of control are just choices that we make. We're not happy with our options. The option is you either assign students grades or you lose your job. But we do choose to do that because we could choose to lose our job, or we could choose to have another job. Now, that's so outside of like the way our brain works that it may not feel like a choice to us. But I think that's why it's so instrumental in what he's saying, because like, you know, when I get home and the laundry basket of dirty clothes is still in the common room, it's very easy for me to say like to my daughter, you are making me upset. It's true that the stimulus is not something that's life-giving for me. But being upset is the choice that I make. And I think that's why this is like the great example is there are things we have to do as teachers that frankly, I don't think represent good pedagogy. But I do have to do them if I want to be employed at institution Q. And ultimately I want to be employed at institution Q. So I might say I put up with that to do my bigger thing. And that's probably like the scaffolding step. And then really taking ownership is I don't just put up with it. I choose to put up with that, right? I choose to do that so that I can meet my larger goal, not just of employment and money, but having a container with a particular group of students to teach what it is that I happen to love or feel empowered to teach. I often don't want to return emails from particular people, especially when they are like accusing me of something or laden with shame. And I can feel like, oh, I have to do it. Like this is like a chain around my neck. But it's really nice to say like, no, the kind of priest and person I am, I choose to respond to those emails. Because I have colleagues that just delete them. I'm going to be honest, they just delete them. Sometimes I envy that. But at the end of the day, I choose to be someone who returns calls. That's important to me, even when I don't want to. You could go the other way on that. but I choose to do it. And it's helpful for me to remember, like, this is actually not a chain. I chose to snap it on. And I get to choose the kind of priest I want to be, right? And like you're going to hear this morning, if you watch church, you're going to hear a lot of discomfort from me about the text. And you're going to hear me like do some like probably downright traditional blasphemy. But I'm real upset about this particular issue. I actually choose to be upset about it. And I choose to use my upsetness to hopefully pass on some observations and some different patterns we can live into. So I hope these are fair enough choices that I'm making.
Hey, after we do some of those scripture readings, it's hard to say thanks be to God.
It's crazy we say that, isn't it? It's crazy to me that we say thanks be to God. Yeah.
Sometimes I use a question mark at the end.
Thanks. Alan, please.
We're visiting we're from Arizona, and we've been watching carefully the events in Texas this week. And nonviolent communication doesn't seem to be used. And we have a lot of people that are really emotional nationwide, certainly here in Arizona, about what's happening in Texas. And I hope this book is just apropos. How do you talk to people about this subject that happened this week on a nonviolent manner? And it's tough. People are really emotional on this subject. And we have a lot of family members that are on both sides. But it's a time. I hope you cover that in your sermon today.
I don't think I'm going to cover it, but I, you know, what we're going to find when we read on, and I shared this story maybe 2 weeks ago with some other people on the screen. And I think it's really important because we're coming up on Rosh Hashanah on Wednesday, right? This is like Jewish New Year. The author of the book is Jewish, and he tells a story about how you'll read this in the book. One time he was on a cab, and the cab got a call, pick up, you know, Mr. Fleischman at the synagogue. And this is like at 5 a.m. And the other guy in the cab says out loud, boy, these kikes get up really early to figure out how to cheat you out of your money. And the author says, like, steam was coming out of my ears for about a minute. And then I tried to like choose nonviolent communication. And ultimately I said, wow, it really sounds like you've had some really tough interactions with Jewish people around money. So he tried to like go where the person was coming from. And the guy said, yeah, that's right, because these people will always cheat you on your money. So he said, all I did was reflect back, and it took 13 minutes until this guy was done. And then at the end of it, the guy was done, it was clear. And he said, you know, boy, I just am feeling a lot of sadness that you haven't had some of the positive experiences regarding Jewish people and money that I've had. Now, this is really important what I said. I really want to make sure you heard me. Would you repeat back what you heard? And the guy says, you're saying I shouldn't talk about Jewish people and money. He says, no, I'm sorry, I didn't make myself really clear. I'm saying I've had some really positive experiences with Jewish people and money. And it hurts my heart to hear that you have not had those positive experiences. And it took like 4 times before the person heard this phrase. He said, you know, I could have been quiet. I could have confronted him and said, don't talk that racist talk around me. But because I didn't do it, because I chose to do neither of those things, I didn't leave the cab with a friend, but I did leave connected to another human being. And this, I think, is a tough bit, Alan, and this is going to show up in the sermon, this part, right, is that, you know, ultimately, I don't think it's fair that people who are oppressed have to teach their oppressors to recognize their humanity, because that's just more repression. And I understand that often that's what it takes. And I think when we hear this little phrase that Jesus says, you know, he sends out 72 people and they come back and they say, hey, Lord, we drove out demons in your name, right? And Jesus has this little phrase that says, you can't drive out Satan with Satan. And so there's this interesting thing where if we think somebody's wrong and that justifies us to treat them like they're wrong, we're doing exactly what we wish they weren't doing. And that's the hard thing. It's not about being a bigger person, because nobody's a bigger person. It's about being a whole person. Right? And if we say, like, you're so mad, I shouldn't have to listen to you. I mean, we just denied part of ourselves. I'm not always that patient. And I was taught not to be patient. I grew up like How to Burn a Bridge in a Second. Like that was my dad's like autobiography. That was the title. How to Burn a Bridge Irrevocably in a Second. I'm really good at burning bridges in a second. Like I'm really good. And I'm really good at like, you know, like holding a cross while I do it and saying like, God wants me to burn this bridge. It's just spiritually sick. Like it's convenient. It's somewhat gratifying. I'm hurting myself when I do it, and I'm not loving my neighbor. And I know all that, and sometimes I'm really okay with it. And that's the sad bit. It's sad for me. It's probably saddest for me, more so than my neighbor. I mean, my neighbor's already decided I'm wrong, so it's no loss to them, right? But it's sad for me that I'm letting something get in the way of common humanity.
On this denial of responsibility piece, there was one that was missing that I've noticed in myself, or Jen's helped me, I guess, is that sometimes what I'm saying I'm feeling and what my face is saying are different.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that, but I guess that's the case. And so I have to be responsible for what my face is saying, and that's my current problem to resolve.
Man,
So,
it's tough. Yeah, my wife says that to me all the time, Mike, for what it's worth. And I want to say, well, I'm showing you honestly what I feel. I'm not, you know, playing games or surreptitious. And it's like, well, yeah, then you're easy to diagnose. You need to spend some more time on your feelings.
Well, I mean, body language and tone is part of how we communicate.
90%.
So you can keep telling me the words, but if they don't match what I'm seeing, and some of that is tied to past history of the human, right? Like that look on someone's face is maybe tied to something from, I don't know, your dad or mom or something along those lines, but recognizing that how you're communicating isn't being received the way that you thought it was is definitely an interesting journey.
You know, this is lovely phrase from the gospel, right? Where Jesus asked this person, do you think I'm able to drive out this unclean spirit? And the response is, Lord, we believe, help us overcome our unbelief. It's so hopeful. It's so hopeful.
And again, it's a process. That verbalizing is the first process. So if we acknowledge, I see you trying, and I like the words, or I appreciate the words.
Yeah.
Let's do some more work together to get the congruence there between words and feelings. It's hard. It is so hard.
This, you know, he's going to do something. I just want to prep you as we continue to read the book. He's going to recommend a lot of practices that are culturally rude. And I want to tell you two of them so that you're not surprised by them. All right. So one of them is, and I'm just going to use my own example. He is a teacher. I'll use his example. He gets done teaching. And on the way out, some lady says, Marshall, you're so brilliant. And he says, hey, I get you're trying to express gratitude, and that means a lot, but I'd actually like to enjoy your gratitude more. So I'm hoping you could share with me something I said and how it touched your heart. Well, I mean, you're just so smart. Well, look, you know, that evaluation is great. I love that evaluation, but I'd actually like to enjoy your gratitude more. So could you tell me one thing I said specifically and how it touched your heart? I'm reading that and I'm like, that's greedy. You're like digging for compliments. And really, like, the other way to frame it is, he's trying to help the person express what they wanted to give in the first place. And we're not good at giving gifts. We're good at giving evaluations. Let me tell you what 95% of people say on the way out the door on Sunday. I don't care who's preaching. Enjoyed your message. Now, I do like being entertaining, you know, like that's part of my personality. I'm an Enneagram part 3, so like I like to put on shows sometimes, but I also would like to enjoy the gratitude deeper than that. Because actually, like, the most important thing is not enjoyment. The most important thing is like we connect with this story that's bigger than ourselves. And I don't feel super comfortable asking people who say, enjoyed your message, hey, I'd like to enjoy your gratitude a little bit more. But what he says is that's actually a really lovely gift you can give somebody because they're trying to give you gratitude. And we're not taught how to do that in a way non-evaluatively that actually connects us to each other. And I feel like that's probably true. I write thank you notes. Many of you have received one from me. And I usually say like, thank you for doing this thing, instead of you're doing this thing made me feel blank because. Now that's a hard thank you note to write. But I've received 1 or 2 of those notes from people over the years who not necessarily trained in this method. And I just enjoy that gratitude so much more than thanks for being generous.
Well, having, when someone gives specifics like that, and I'm not good at that either, I'm much more likely to say, oh, that was very nice.
Mhm.
But when you can be specific, then it lets that person know what to do more of, because that's what resonated, you know, with someone who probably is representative of other people as well. And then you know where to direct your attention or what to do less of if it's the other way. But it's really helpful. It's more concrete feedback.
Absolutely. Peggy?
I try to do that with Mike almost every week and tell him exactly what in his sermon connected with us. In the writing project that I directed for 20 years, we call that pointing.
Mhm.
And it's really important to know specifically what's helping.
Yeah, you do. And I'm grateful for it, by the way, because you take the time. And I think this is part of it, right? Like you're writing those emails shows that you take the time, not just in the moment, but later to return to the elements that were important. And I feel like you take the communication seriously enough and conscientiously enough to make a container to express where it touched you. And that just makes me feel seen. It makes me feel like appreciated for not like being a particular person, but for doing this particular work. And it's extremely validating for me in my call and what I'd like to do.
It also helps us, Ellen and I discuss the sermon afterwards and talk about it because each of us gets something different. So sometimes he responds and mostly I respond.
Lila, are you still with us? I know you'd mentioned to me in an email yesterday, you said, OMG, how powerful this is. And I just was hoping you'd say more.
Yes, I am here. I'm here in the chapel, actually, and it's lovely. Yes, I was really struck by what this man is saying. It captured me. I was mesmerized. And he says in the book, there's nothing new here. He's just bringing it all together. And I think he's expressing it very beautifully. A way to connect with people that may not agree with you on important issues, or just connect better with our loved ones. And I am eager to practice this method with anyone here. Get in touch with me so we can try it, because it's not really my habit when I greet people that I care for and appreciate. And I would like to express that better. That's a place to start for me. And then maybe eventually I can work this into loving my enemies a little bit, which is an elusive goal for me. It's really hard. There's something he said here. I was looking for it. I couldn't find it, but he talks about this process as changing the person that's practicing it. It's not just a way of speaking and interacting. It's a different way of being that is so appealing to me and very life-giving. And there certainly needs to be more communication in our world. And I'm ready to give it a go, vulnerable or not. I'm not sure I even care about being vulnerable anymore. I just want to get better at it. I mean, I want to connect with people better too. Okay, somebody say something.
I don't want to call on Antha or Rhonda or Tim and Graziella, but I want to just make some space if any of you'd like to reflect on where you are with this work. And you don't have to. Rhonda, please.
Okay, I'm just really excited about this whole topic and just looking forward to how it will change my life. And it's very valuable to hear everybody kind of fill in a lot of information and feelings about it. So I'm really hoping for good things, and I'm hoping he's got some more instructions for us coming up.
Thank you. Oh, Graziella, I see your mouth moving, but I think you might still be on mute.
Yeah, I had a lot of feelings about this, the content, because I got my master's in counseling years ago. Okay, it's been, what is it? 55 years ago. And a lot of what is in here is precisely what I learned 55 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not different at all, but and I was a sixth grade teacher. I was a middle school teacher. So I was applying some of what I was learning at the university with my kids. I have trouble talking about it because it's been so long, but it was the whole thing, the whole experience of reading just as much as I did here was very powerful for me and touching, and brought back many, many memories of specific interactions with children. I'm talking about inner city kids. So I'm just rambling a little bit, but it was really a special. It's a pretty great book. It's a good book. So.
Antha, you look like you're leaning forward.
Well, I'm contemplating whether I want to be a troublemaker, Mike, so I'm gonna go for it.
Troublemaker.
Go for it.
I am struggling with most of my daytime hours are spent being an engineer. And being an engineer means evaluating whether or not it's going to work, and how I feel doesn't matter, and what I personally need doesn't matter. If the radio doesn't work, the ship can't dock to the space station. So I'm trying to figure out how this fits in, or if it fits in to a lot of the conversations that I have every working day. And there are some where it does, where I've got to work with other people and talk to them about their work product. But even so, the bottom line for us is it right? Will the thing work? And feelings don't matter. So I'm struggling, and like Rhonda, I'm hoping for more instructions.
Thank you. And I hope actually you'll answer your own question as we continue on. And I'm not in any way the expert. I've read the book. We're all reading the book. But I will say this conversation that I had this week with this person regarding like what counsel, what's the moral position about like women's sexuality, abortion. I realized maybe for the first time, I've said before in church that I think actually judgment is really great. We go to school to be judges and to analyze and be critical. Our issue is condemnation. We're not invited to condemn each other, we're invited to judge. But I think like the turn of phrase that emerged in this particular conversation is, the thing we need to judge are systems and not human beings. And that seems like maybe like just a further step, right? So like in this particular issue, I could talk about a choice a woman makes, but I think that's a little bit, not only is it non-connective, I think it like misses the empathy bit here, when instead I can talk about a system, right, in which women have to bear the brunt of sometimes decisions that were made by two people, sometimes made by one person on the woman, right? So I can judge that system. And when I start to judge the individuals, that's where I think it starts to get sticky, because I didn't know the context. And so that feels, you know, like Antha, I think like you're saying, again, I'm just kind of, I get that there's when we do a math problem, there's probably a right answer and a wrong answer at the end, right? But I do think there's something to be said about the difference between speaking the truth and speaking the truth in love. And because we're co-laboring on these things, speaking the truth in love seems pretty important. Well, I'm really grateful that we've read this and that we're talking about it. And if you don't want it, let me know, but I actually would like to just email you the resources. They were in the e-news, but I'd like to email them to you. I'll show you what they look like. They're like 2 or 3 pages. Evaluative words confused with feelings. Like, I feel betrayed. Probably you really feel angry, hurt, disappointed, or enraged, but you probably don't feel betrayed. That's an evaluation on what the other person did, right? So this handy chart, like instead of saying, I feel harassed, it tells you feeling words you might use instead, right? And this is where my friend has made this deck of cards. So on one side is like, I feel cheated. And on the other side is, I actually feel resentful, hurt, and angry, if that makes sense. So I'm going to send you that. I'm going to send you some key differentiations, like I'm guessing versus I know, right? Because a lot of times we say I know when really we're just guessing, right? So like some of these things here. And then I'm going to send you, if you want, these pieces that are like, awareness of needs of ours. Like I have a need for inclusion and mutuality. I have a need to be seen. I have a need to be heard. By the way, all human beings have these needs, says Viktor Frankl, right? And on the other side is a sheet of feelings when needs are perceived as met, like I'm satisfied, I'm relaxed, I'm alive. And feelings when they're not met, like I'm bitter, I'm disgusted. That actually is a feeling, disgust. It's like one of our primordial feelings, one of the 9 that we have. So I'm going to send these to you. If you don't want them, just delete them. But I'm going to send them to you. And particularly because Lila and Adele and I said we want to practice, and maybe some of the rest of you do too. These are some practice instruments that may or may not be helpful for you. Next week, we'll chat about chapters 3 and 4, if that seems okay. And I very much look forward to continuing this nonviolent conversation.